Oliver J. Thomas, Professor of all things important, especially naps in the sunshine, would like to inform you that fairy tale retellings are not his cup of tea. He much prefers a good costume drama. As you can tell, he has very sophisticated taste. Sleep tidily.
I love to read a book and be absorbed in words to escape.
Hi guys, so I'm just trying to do a bit of a rehash of my Renee Recommends short story anthologies. I did an edition of this years ago, back in 2011. There have been many more anthologies encountered since then, and I am now in possession of several more that I heartily recommend. So I will be focusing on fairytale and fantasy anthologies, and there are so many out there in the world that I want to get my hands on. These are just some that I own and have read and enjoyed. We'll start off with YA themed titles. Two that I do heartily recommend if you're encountering fairy tale retellings for the first time. One would be Rags and Bones, New Twists on Timeless Tales. Folks like Neil Gaiman have stories in here, and what I like is that it's not simply fairy tale retellings. There's some myths that are tackled. There's even a retelling of Christina Rossetti's poem The Goblin Market, which I'm a big fan of, so that was pretty cool to see that in here. It's a good, I think, starting point if this is your first time encountering this particular subgenre. There's also Grimm, which is a recent-ish YA publication. Folks like Ellen Hopkins, Julie Kagawa, Amanda Hocking have stories in here. Ellen Hopkins has a really evocative and effective verse retelling of Beauty and the Beast, which I quite enjoyed. Also Melinda Lowe, who's known for her Cinderella retelling Ash. She has a short story in here which was quite good. So again, Grimm's a good one to start with. There are a number of YA fantasy anthologies that cover all different subgenres. There's many out there. You can find several steampunk ones, there's at least 2 vampire ones, there's zombies versus unicorns, I have a period drama one, so there's plenty that you can find. 2 that I own and quite like, I've got Kiss Me Deadly, which is Tales of Paranormal Romance. I got this one especially because Diana Peterfront, who is the author of the Killer Unicorn duology, she has a prequel short story in here that focuses on the universe and the mythology of her Killer Unicorn books, and I absolutely had to read that because I'm a big fan, so I really loved encountering that story in here. This one is Enthralled, Paranormal Diversions. Melissa Marr edited it, which was a big selling point for me because I love her. She has a work in here as well, and this is focused around journeys, physical journeys, and the transformations they can bring out inside, and I quite appreciate that. I studied the theme of journeys a great deal in high school, so I've come to quite appreciate it as a narrative device, so I liked reading these ones as well. Kiss Me Deadly and Enthralled. Some standalone anthologies from YA authors. We've got Lips Touched 3 Times by Laini Taylor. This is really evocative, really atmospheric, very lyrical writing without being heavy-handed. There's also the inclusion of really cool illustrations that are kind of done in a graphic novel form by Laini Taylor's husband. There's only 3 stories in here, as the title would suggest, but they're just very interesting. Laini approaches mythology in a very hands-on, very detailed fashion, and I was so happy that I came away from this as a really positive experience because I'd had mixed feelings with Lani's novel, The Daughter of Smoke and Bone. I half loved it, half hated it. The side of it that I loved was the mythology building, and that's what's really excellent in here. Even though these are just short tales, you still get a really rich sense of the world that these characters are inhabiting, and I really recommend it. 2 anthologies from quite popular YA fantasy authors. Both of these collections do feature characters and settings and environments from series by these authors, so there are characters from Melissa Marr's Wicked Lovely series in some of these short stories, and likewise there are characters from Holly Black's Modern Fairytale series in here in The Poison Eaters, but you don't have to be familiar with those works to be able to understand and comprehend everything that's going on in here, and they both have a very skillful way of crafting quite ancient, timeless seeming folklore and melding it really effectively into a contemporary setting. But also, neither of them are afraid to tackle darker subject matter and present things in a grittier, more realistic fashion. It always just blends together really, really seamlessly. Moving on to more adult fiction, the anthology that I think most people would readily recommend if you really want to get into fairy tale retellings and it's possibly your first time, would of course be Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, pictured here. I used to own my own copy, again lent it to someone, never got it back, so I'm going to have to get a new one. Angela Carter is possibly the queen of the fairy tale retelling. Her work came about in the 70s alongside people like Anne Sexton, whose poetry transformations tackled fairy tale themes and characters as well. And this was, of course, in the second wave feminism age, so Angela Carter was one of the first people to really sit down and revisit these classic tales from a feminist perspective and to weave in the ideas of female sexuality and the woman's role in these stories. And she does so in an incredibly rich and evocative way. And like Neil Gaiman, can completely twist things around in such a short space of time. Her Snow White retelling is chilling to the bone, and it is only a page and a half long. When you read it, you will understand why. Once you've read it, it cannot leave your mind ever. Her skill was incredible, and she brought adult, critical, serious attention to these fairy tales once more. And also the 80s fantasy coming-of-age film In the Company of Wolves, directed by Neil Jordan. I highly recommend you watch that if you haven't seen it before. The screenplay of that film was written by Carter, and it was based upon 3 stories from The Bloody Chamber. Definitely check that out and pick up and read the Bloody Chamber stories. Highly influential on all the authors that followed in this subgenre, and she was just a master at what she did, so absolutely must read. Neil Gaiman, of course, is a master of the short story format, I believe. The first of his short story collections I encountered was called Smoke and Mirrors. I don't have my copy anymore. I lent it to a friend and never got it back. When will I learn? So I will show the image here. This collection's particularly notable for me for its very, very disturbing but incredibly memorable retelling of Snow White, second only to Angela Carter's version, the most haunting Snow White revisiting I've ever encountered. But as always, Neil Gaiman just is so talented that he can turn my worldview on characters and tropes and scenarios I thought I was familiar with a few simple sentences and just completely twist everything around, and it's really amazing how he does that. Smoke and Mirrors especially, I think it's a fantastic collection. There's also Fragile Things, which I recently got a copy of. I have read it all before, and this one also had a very notable tale. The Problem with Susan completely changed how I viewed the Narnia characters. I will never look at that world in quite the same way. Thank you, Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman's short stories, check them out. You'll love them because who doesn't love Neil Gaiman? The man is a rock star. 2 anthologies edited by Kate Bernheimer that I really love are My Mother She Killed Me, My Father He Ate Me, 40 New Fairy Tales, and xoOrpheus, 50 New Myths. These are fantastic anthologies. There's so many authors and so many stories covered in here. You get a really wide variety of tales that are tackled and tons of new authors to discover. There's such a broad scope of subject matter being covered. For the most part, these are all modern retellings, but you don't have to be familiar at all with the original fairy tales or the original myths to very quickly get the sense of what's going on. The other thing I adore about these editions is that they include afterwards from each author explaining why they chose that particular tale, what relevance it has to them and to their lives, and why they chose to tackle it and recraft it in the way that they did, and I just really love that, the inclusion of that. So certainly pick these up, and because there are so many stories included, you will always be able to come back and read something new. I haven't read them all cover to cover. I just pick them up from time to time and visit a new one. And so there's plenty to discover in here. Highly recommended. Being a bit patriotic here with some anthologies featuring Australian authors, there's Tales from the Tower Volume 1, The Wilful Eye, pictured here because a friend is borrowing my copy. And Tales from the Tower Volume 2, The Wicked Wood. Isabel Carmody collected and curated these, which was primarily why I wanted to pick them up. I love Isabel Carmody. The first edition, The Wilful Eye, like Kate Bernheimer's installments, does include the authors explaining why they chose the tale that they chose to tackle, which again I love. Sadly that isn't included in The Wicked Wood for some reason, but I still highly recommend these anthologies, and I just love that Aussie fantasy authors are getting a chance to shine. And these installments especially have some incredibly dark, quite graphic, quite unsettling stories. They're all the more admirable and memorable for that, I believe, and I just like promoting Aussie authors, so if you can get your hands on the Tales from the Tower series, do. In my recent book haul I mentioned Queen Victoria's Book of Spells, an anthology of gaslamp fantasy. This is edited by Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow, and they are names that are pretty much synonymous with fairy tale retellings these days. They have curated many collections over the years. This is the first one of theirs that I've owned, and it's a melding of things I love, the Victorian period with fantasy and magic and supernatural goings on. But all of them are incredibly entertaining. Some are quite surprisingly dark and grim. There's some quite sinister turns that go on in some of these stories, but I really enjoyed this anthology. Again, it was just a mashup of things I love anyway, so the fangirl in me was freaking out with joy. Another collection that very effectively melds the Victorian period with magic is Susanna Clarke's The Ladies of Grace Adieu and Other Stories, and Susanna Clarke is of course quite well known for her epic high fantasy Victorian novel Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I own a hardback edition of this and it's really quite beautiful. It's lovely in pink here. There's also the inclusion of some illustrations which are perfectly Victorian in their feel and tone. She's incredibly talented at crafting morally grey characters. There's often a bittersweet, open-ended feel to the conclusion of many of her stories, and I really appreciate that. She's not afraid to suggest often quite sinister and uncomfortable goings-on under the veneer of, you know, of elegance and dignity and whatnot that was supposedly embodied in the Victorian period in England. She's incredibly clever. There is a lot of readers do say this, and I agree that there is a strong Jane Austen flavour to her writing. So if you're a Jane Austen fan, I think that it's probably going to be pretty easy for you to enjoy Susanna Clarke's work. And The Ladies of Grace Adieu is just a really worthwhile read. Okay, so I will come back for part 2 with more fairy tale anthology recommendations.